Hi again, everybody. Professor H here. In this chapter, we're going to look at how biology influences behavior. I'm very sorry that we're not meeting in person because it is a lot easier to explain some of the concepts in this chapter if I'm able to write on the board, draw some stuff, and answer your questions live and in person. But I will do the best that I can. We talked briefly in a previous chapter about some of the controversies in psychology, including the nature versus nurture debate. As mentioned before, both contribute to who we are, how we think, feel, and behave. Charles Darwin is very influential in biopsychology, as his ideas about natural selection and evolution explain how organisms adapt and change in response to their environments. His theory of evolution suggests that organisms who are able to adapt to their environment are the ones that are able to have offsprings and pass on their genes. Those who are not able to adapt are not able to reproduce, and therefore their genes are not passed on. For example, in the Galapagos, there have been some studies about different types of birds. And as the environment has changed, it was found that some birds were able to continue to thrive. And those particular birds are ones that had these long curved beaks. So as their environment changed, these birds with the long curved beaks were able to survive. They were able to also pass on their genes to their offspring. The birds that maintained the thicker, shorter beaks were unable to forage properly, and therefore they were unable to reproduce, so their genes were not maintained in the gene pool of that particular species. This is a really good example of how evolution works. Those who still have the thicker beaks, they're out. Their young will not, if they do manage to survive, only their babies with the curved beaks will probably live to survive for the next generation. So therefore, the birds in the next generation with the skinny curved beaks would also reproduce and pass on their genes. So they have successfully adapted. As you can see in that example, the changes in environment lead to an eventual change in the birds. Evolutionary psychology applies these same principles to changes in human beings, as humans also adapt and change to survive in their environment. Evolutionary psychologists are interested in the universal patterns where nature and nurture interact. For example, something that an evolutionary psychologist might study is our mate selection. Mate selection in human beings. What is it that women want? What is it that men want? And they look at these things from an evolutionary perspective. Behavioral genetics takes a look at how our experiences and our genetic makeup impact our behavior in a more individualized manner. So it's more looking at a kind of a narrower range there. Research in this field often look at family members, and they try to fish out how much of certain human characteristics are due to genetics and how much is due to the environment. For example, it has been found that the heritability of intelligence is around 0.5 to 0.7, which is very strong. But intelligence is also influenced by environment. So although we know there is a very strong genetic factor in determining intelligence, we also know that environment plays a role. For example, any type of deprivation in early childhood, lack of nutrition, lack of stimulation, things like that can actually have a long-term effect on intelligence. And genotype and phenotype, I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Our genetic material, our chromosomes, are found in the nucleus of each of our cells. On these chromosomes, let's see, here's the chromosome right here. Oop, this guy. On our chromosomes, we find our DNA. So these spirally things of DNA are making up this chromosome. These chromosomes, this DNA is going to help us code for certain proteins. So on the strands of DNA, you see little sections called genes. So this little section is a gene, and we're going to talk about genes in a few minutes. And we inherit half of our genes from our mother and half from our father. So half of our genetic material comes from mom, Half of our genetic material comes from dad. All right. There's almost an infinite number of combinations that can be made from the parents' genetics. There's some interesting stuff that happens that kind of stirs things up, so that you can have siblings that look very different from one another and act very different from one another. So depending on the genetic roll of the dice is kind of how we all are. We have 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs, 23 from our mother that are paired with 23 from our dad. Every cell in our bodies consists of 46 chromosomes, with the exception of their gametes, which are the eggs in the female and the sperm in the males. These obviously are going to carry the 23 from mom in her egg, 23 from dad in the sperm. Those combine to make our 46 chromosomes. As mentioned earlier, our genetics can influence many things, including our hormones, neurotransmitter production, some of our brain structures. Our genetics can even give us predispositions for things like depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia, but that does not mean that these conditions will be expressed or developed. In many cases, for these conditions to develop, the genetic predisposition would need to be combined with certain environmental influences. And we'll take a look more at that in another slide. Okay, Albert Einstein is one of the greatest minds of all time. I like to use him for an example. What would have happened if Einstein was in a different environment and he never was given the opportunity to learn to read? Would he have found another way to express his intelligence? Most likely he would have. He would have used his fabulous mind to improve or contribute to whatever environment he was in, but we would not know of his genius. Einstein was able to live up to his great potential because he was in an environment that nurtured his ability to learn and think. Einstein had a range of reaction that would allow for his genius to develop under the right environmental circumstances. Another example of range of reaction can be demonstrated with looking at height. Let's say that someone has a genetic potential to reach 6.5 feet tall. Their range of reaction would be to allow for this height to develop. However, if this person is deprived of proper nutrition or has other health issues, they would not be able to grow to their maximum possible height. The range of reaction refers to a fixed and limited range of genetic expression. Another concept to consider is the genetic environmental correlation. In this view, our environment can impact the expression of genes, and the expression of genes can affect our environment. So, for example, with Einstein, his environment allowed him to express his genes in a, to the outside range of reaction for his intelligence. An example that we can see of how the expression of genes can affect our environment is if we consider the child of a parent who is an NBA player. So this kid might be born with a really strong genetic predisposition to be able to play basketball. Also, they're born into an environment that would probably nurture that skill and give them the opportunity to maximize their ability to play basketball. They would be able to go to that outside limits of their range of reaction for playing basketball. However, say this kid decides they don't want to play basketball and they don't really like basketball and they're more intellectual. Maybe they enjoy reading or sewing, or reading and sewing. Let's say this kid likes reading and sewing. So in this particular situation, this child has a predisposition to, or has, really likes these things. So what can happen in this case is that the parent will actually alter the environment for that child. So instead of pushing this kid to play basketball, they might say, okay, this kid really seems to be intellectual and likes to sew, so I'm going to provide the opportunities needed for this child to be able to grow in those areas. So they would be able to express their genetic abilities with their intellect and with their sewing ability. So in that case, this child's influencing their own environment. So that's an example of that. Okay. All right. Let me see what else we got for this. Oh, mutations. All right. Mutations and epigenetics. Epigenetics refers to the gene-environment interaction, such as how the same genotypes lead to different phenotypes. So our genotype, remember, is our genetic makeup. That's what is in our genes. The phenotype is what we see. Oftentimes, we have things in our genotype that are not expressed outwardly. They're not in our phenotype. We do not see them. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about that in just a minute or two. The example given in your book is looking at identical twins. Identical twins are 100% genetically identical as they both come from the same initial cell. However, in some cases, one twin may develop cancer and the other may not. In some cases, the identical twins will develop differently due to differences in their environment as well. The last note on this slide is about mutations. So mutations are sudden and permanent changes in a gene. Some of these can be helpful and some can be harmful. In our example of the birds with the curved beaks, this gene for curved beaks was a mutation that proved to be adaptive. Therefore, that particular mutation was passed on. However, in the example in your book with the twins with one of them developing cancer, the twin that had a mutation that resulted in having cancer, in that case, that mutation was harmful. All right, I said we'd take a closer look at how the genetics in our genotype and phenotype work, and we're going to get started on that right now. Environment has an impact on the expression of genes. Genotype is the genetic makeup of a person or organism, whereas phenotype is what you see outwardly. Here's an example. There's a tribe in Africa where the people are extremely tall. The genetic makeup, the genotype of these people allow them to grow very tall, which is the phenotype. That's what we outwardly see. However, if there is a time of famine or when adequate nutrition is not available, this impacts how tall the person will be. They will have a phenotype that is much shorter than what is possible by their genotype. They cannot grow as tall because the lack of nutrition has limited the expression of this gene. So they may have the gene to be tall, but unfortunately, they were unable to grow to their full height. Most traits that we inherit, such as height, skin tone, and hair color, are what we call polygenetic, meaning that they are controlled by more than one gene. To give a brief overview of how some genes are outwardly expressed, which is phenotype, remember, the expression is the phenotype, and some are present in the genotype but not outwardly seen in the phenotype. I will use an example of eye color. All right, so this first graph that we see here, we're using what's called a Punnett square. And we are taking a look at the genotype and phenotype for eye color in our examples. And eye color is a little bit more complicated than this, but this is just kind of an easy way that we can explain how the genes work. So in this example, we have mom. Mom has brown eyes. Dad has brown eyes also. However, they both carry a recessive gene for blue eyes. So this capital B in our examples is going to represent brown eyes. This lowercase b is going to represent blue eyes. Brown eyes are a dominant gene. Dominant meaning that they are the stronger gene that's going to express. It's going to be seen in the phenotype. The blue gene is a recessive gene, which is not going to be outwardly seen unless you have two copies of this recessive gene. So anytime we have this dominant gene seen, we're going to see blue eyes. So these are the four combinations that we see right here possible for this combination. So we have dad, he's got brown eyes. We know that because he has this brown eye gene, which is a dominant gene. He also carries a recessive gene for blue eyes. Same with mom. So in this particular combination, we have a B, we have a brown-eyed gene and a brown-eyed gene. So this child is going to have brown eyes, and genetically, they only carry the gene for brown eyes. So this kid will not have blue-eyed kids later on. Here we have the brown-eyed gene and one gene for blue eyes. Once again, this child's going to have brown eyes because this brown-eyed gene is dominant. In this example up here, in this case, the blue-eyed gene has been inherited from mom and the brown-eyed gene from dad. So once again, because that brown-eyed gene is present and it's dominant, this kid's going to have brown eyes. Our last example is that this child got a blue-eyed gene from mom, a blue-eyed gene from dad. Whammo. This kid has blue eyes because you have to have 2 copies of this recessive gene in order to express that trait, which in this case is blue eyes. So with this combination, if we have 2 brown-eyed people, they can have a blue-eyed kid. They both have to carry a recessive gene for blue eyes in order for that to occur. So there's like a 25% chance that this combination will produce a blue-eyed child. In our next combination, right here, oops, I think I went past one. Okay, in our next example, let's see which one we're on here. Nope, that's the same. Okay. Okay, in this example, mom has brown eyes and dad has blue eyes. Okay, in this, mom is going to pass on this dominant gene for brown eyes to each of these kids. So in this case, we're going to see that all of these children have brown eyes because mom does not carry that recessive blue gene. However, any of these kids, all of them carry a recessive blue gene that they inherited from dad. So there is a possibility that these children of this couple could have blue eyes. There's 0% that kids, that these 2 people can produce a blue-eyed child, but their children could go on and produce a blue-eyed child. Okay. The next thing we want to talk about is heritability. Heritability is a measure of how well differences in people's genes account for differences in their traits. Some researchers study heritability, and this is, things like height, eye color, intelligence, as well as disorders like schizophrenia are studied. For example, intelligence is a trait that is strongly influenced by heredity, starting at about 20% in infancy and going to about 80% in adulthood. And this is based on a study that I saw by Plowman and Deary, 2015. I just read this one the other day. What other factors can influence heredity? Well, as mentioned previously, our environment can. Malnutrition, sensory deprivation, all sorts of things can influence heredity. Those who study behavioral genetics often use family studies, adoption studies, and studies of identical twins who are raised apart to examine how much a trait is due to genetic influence and how much is due to environment. These types of studies allow for the comparison of family members and variations between them. Twin studies are a favorite, especially if it involves identical twins, which are monozygotic twins, which are raised apart. In this case, twins are in separate environments, so it's kind of easier to see what may be due to environment and what may be due to genetics. And there's a couple of famous studies out there that you can look at. The Minnesota study, twin study, where they found that a lot of these twins that were raised apart have amazingly similar characteristics, such as like tidiness and even driving the same kind of truck. I mean, different types of things like that were interesting, that they could see may have a genetic component because they were raised in very different families. All right, that's it for that. Here's some terms about twins. We mentioned monozygotic twins. Monozygotic twins are 2 embryos that are developed from 1 egg. They are genetically identical. Dizygotic twins develop from two different eggs, and they are genetically individual. They are no more similar to one another than they are to other siblings. So, the only type that are identical are the ones that come from that one egg that splits to create the twins. All right, let's take another quick look at how genes and environment interact. Tianeri and colleagues, 2004, did a study of adoptees who have biological moms with and without schizophrenia and the impact of environment. So what they did is they have two groups here that there's two main groups. We have moms who had schizophrenia and moms without schizophrenia. So these are children adopted from moms with schizophrenia, which have a high genetic risk for developing the disorder, and moms, kids who were adopted and had genetic, biological moms without schizophrenia. So they had low genetic risk. What they found was quite interesting. If a child who had a biological mom with schizophrenia was adopted into a home that was much less than ideal, and in this study it's called a disturbed home environment, they had a 36.8% chance of developing schizophrenia. Whereas the children who had biological moms with schizophrenia who were adopted into a healthy home environment only had a 5.8% chance of developing the disorder. So you can see how environment plays an important role. Now, of the children who had moms who did not have, the biological moms who did not have schizophrenia, they were at a lower genetic risk. But if they were adopted into a home that had a disturbed home environment, 5.3% developed schizophrenia. Whereas those adopted into a healthy home environment, 4.8 developed the disorder. So this is just another way to take a look at how our genes and environment interact. All right, so this concludes this particular presentation. I hope you guys find this helpful, and I will see you guys in the next presentation. Bye.